The Spin-off Podcast Network.
This is our ahi komo, our ahi whita.
It's dusk at Ihumaatao on the glittering shores of the Manukau Harbour. I'm with Pania Newton and some of her whanaunga next to a huge fire pit cemented into the middle of the road at the entrance to the papakainga. Tonight, the logs on the ahi are only just beginning to glow and gather heat.
It changes its name sometimes. It might be te ahi ka, the blazing fire, or te ahi komo, the long burning fire, or whita, the flickering flame, depending on the wairua of the ahi.
When it was first lit in 2019, the wairua of this ahi at Ihumaatao ignited the whole country.
It was burning constantly for 1,087 days.
You might remember seeing Pania on the news at the time. She was the māngai for SOUL, Save Our Unique Landscape, the campaign to protect Ihumaatao.
We are planning to come to Ihumaatao and evict the defenders of the land there.
The direct action at Ihumaatao has ended, but the fire continues to burn.
Lots of us come up here and light the fire when we want to have a wānanga, or when we want to have a tangi, or when we want to have an argue, and just sit around the ahi and just give it all to the ahi.
But it's not just a place to keep warm or to talk things through. The ahi is a symbol of occupation, of ahi ka.
And so when I see that smoke go across, I think about how our tupuna and how significant that was to inform other hapu and whānau that there was a whānau or a pā or a hapu here occupying and thriving on this whenua.
Even though there are enormous challenges, the ahi remains as a symbol of the unbroken rights to self-determination of tangata whenua.
We're just doing the mahi and working towards achieving the aspirations that our whānau have for this whenua. Now, true mana motuake nā rangatiratanga, ka koke atonu ngā mahi, ka mahi atonu ngā mahi mo ake.
This is Ko Papa Ko Rangi, Season 2, Ahi Ka, a podcast from Te Kōmata o Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge. Kia ora, ko Nadine Hura ahau, no Ngā Tihine, no Ngāpuhi, no Airani o Kitupuna, and I'm a writer, I'm a mama, and I'm one of the kaitaka wainga of the Deep South Challenge, along with you, Ruia.
Hi, kia ora e te tuaine Nadine. Lovely to be here and welcome to our family. Taku ingoa ko Ruia Aperahama. I am the pautikanga of the Deep South Challenge, Kōmata o Te Tonga. A trier of lots of things and a master of nothing, my wife would say.
Oh, I'm pretty sure you're a competent kaiwaiata.
And a dishwasher too.
Well, I think I'll just leave the singing and the dishes to you either way. Heoi, our job is to introduce this podcast and to set the scene a little bit for what it's about.
Yeah, talking about Deep South Challenge, I thought there was an ice cream.
No, there is an ice cream brand called Deep South, but our kaupapa has more to do with global warming and melting ice caps in the Southern Ocean.
Well, that doesn't sound like an ice cream company.
No, the Deep South Challenge is a climate adaptation research platform. And for the past 2 years, the Vision Mātauranga program has been supporting 14 whānau, hapu and iwi-led research projects. We know that's important because the causes of climate change and the adaptive solutions vary a lot depending on who's telling the story.
That's right, because we don't actually use the word climate change. It's our disconnection to Ranginui and Papatuanuku. Because what I notice is that in the science or in government, it's a silo. And puts us into a silo. But for you and I and our people and our Vision Mātauranga teams, it's mana motu hake, tino rangatiratanga,
That's so true. The research teams we'll be hearing from tend to frame climate adaptation in terms of connection and restoration of balance, reciprocity and protection. And we also hear a lot about responsibility, looking at the role of colonisation in causing climate change, and of course te tiriti o Waitangi as the most powerful tool we have to address the challenges. And that's something that came up in our first series, which you were a part of, Ruia. But in this podcast, we're going to be doing things a bit differently. I'm breaking out of the studio and taking the mic directly to the communities who are on the ground doing the mahi.
Oh, so what's that going to look like? Or should I say, what's that going to sound like?
Good question. Well, what it sounds like, literally, is burning home fires. Ahi ka.
Okay, get in the Mars van. Hide.
It sounds like communities who aren't waiting around to be rescued, but are getting on with the mahi in front of them.
There are 4 places that you journeyed to. Tell me a bit about that.
Okay, so we're visiting Tairāwhiti, Gisborne, where communities are still grappling with the fallout of 2 cyclones.
It's just a debris trail from the mountain to the ocean.
Man has to change its practices to heal Papatuanuku and Tangaroa.
We'll travel down the Wanganui River to a marae luring kids home with earling.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place right through to the end of your life.
And stopping in at Takapuahia in Porirua, Ngāti Toa Rangatira.
I tell everyone, I'm succession planning, man.
And we'll be heading to Piki 2 in Waikato for a final gathering with all the 14 research teams funded by the Deep South Challenge.
The fire will burn and the smoke will reek of what is mana Māori motuhake.
And in each episode, I'll be touching base with you, Ruia, as our potikanga, just to hear your reflections and to unpack some of the different themes that are emerging.
Wow, Te Tuine, that sounds exciting. Where are we starting first?
So, first up, we're heading to Ihumaatao to meet our first research team from the hapu of Te Ahiwaru and descendants of the great tohunga Hape and the people of Waiohua. Now, a lot of people are going to be familiar with parts of this story, but not everyone will know just how Land Back and the campaign to protect Ihumaatao has climate action at its heart. Even if you've never been to Ihumaatao, at some point in your life, you've probably walked upon the stones that have come from this very whenua.
A lot of our maunga were quarried.
This is Stacey Bishop. She's also an uri of Ihumaatao and a key taiao researcher in the Te Ahiwaru team.
We had about 7 peaks, tihi, of our maunga that were quarried away. Now they're pito, they're belly buttons, they're inverted, and we can only use our imagination now to look at our maunga because they're gone.
For centuries, the volcanic scoria rock at Ihumaatao was prized by tangata whenua. Filled with ventricles, scoria circulates air and heat in much the same way as our lungs. It was used in fires and to fortify pa, and especially ingeniously to help raise kumara, brought over from Hawaii that weren't accustomed to the colder climate of Aotearoa. Scoria provided warmth, insulation and drainage, and the tāpapa, the kumara beds, flourished here. The land and resources at Ihumaatao were so famously fertile, it was known as the Kai Bowl of Tāmaki Makaurau. But with colonisation, everything changed. Those precious rocks were quarried, blasted out, dug up and carted away and put to other uses in other places.
They went on the roads and whatever other infrastructure the Crown needed to use to build their business capacity.
You can't bring back the maunga that were quarried away, no. But we can retell those stories about what it once was, and through that too we can help restore the mauri of those maunga.
This is Pania Newton again.
Ko puke tāpapa te maunga, ko oruarangi te awa, ko te mānukanuka hoturua te moana. Ko hape te rangatira, ko kaiwhare te tupua, ko makaurau te marae, ko te ahiwaru, Ngāti Mahuta, te Waiohua, ngā hapu, ngā whānau. Ara ko te ihu o Mataoho, te tūranga waiwai. if that's what we recite when we first introduce ourselves, and if those are the things that we claim and we are most connected to, we have a responsibility to care for them. And for us here in Ihumaatao, those things which we connect to are currently at threat.
So just a couple of things, whānau, before we head out.
We're at a part of Ihumaatao called the Ōtutoa Stonefields Reserve, and I'm about to join one of the public walking tours led by the hapu of Te Ahiwaru.
Ko tēnei whenua he wāhi tapu, so if you've got kai, please leave your kai in the car till we come back.
In addition to containing the oldest human-made structures dating back to the early colonial period, they are, more significantly, the site of the only intact natural stone fields in Aotearoa, where you will find lava caves and tunnels, as well as the remains of those kumara beds and cooking areas built so long ago.
We're going to all gather up here. We're just going to tuku mahi ki te whenua I te tuatahi, and then we'll get on our way. Come mai. Tuia ki te rangi e tū.
Our tour guide today is Kiane Matata Sepu. She works with Pania and Stacey in the Te Ahiwaru research team.
Now, someone asked about taking photos. You're only allowed to take photos if you get my good side. What we do ask is that you don't video record or audio record, but record it on the hikoi.
We stopped recording here, but we caught up with Kiane later around the ahi. As well as being one of the founding members of Soul, she's an author, activist, and the producer of the award-winning Puka Puka and podcast Nuku, celebrating mana wahine.
Okay, ko Kiane Matata Sipu tōku ingoa, he uri a hau no te whenua haumako o te Ihumaatao ho, he uri no te Waiohua, te Ahiwaru, te Akitai, Waikato, Ngāpuhi, Ngātipukiao, Rarotonga me Mangaia.
She explained beautifully why they're so protective of their kōrero.
Unless you walk the whenua with the people of that whenua, any whenua, and understand the history of that whenua, you won't get the real impact of those little moments. Well, they're not little moments, but big moments. But those key moments in history.
The crowds are growing, and they're continuing to grow at a protest in South Auckland where hundreds of people are opposing a major housing development on Māori ancestral land.
The original injustice has always been the crown theft of tangata whenua land.
When you go on this hikoi at Ihumaatao, you're not just learning about the occupation, which is what a lot of people think. And it's like, oh no, 2019 is like a speck. It's a grain of sand in the history of what's happened to Ihumaatao. For me, there is a real importance about putting your feet on that land, about hearing how the wind blows, about listening to the way that the rocks fall as you stand over them. Because it's not just about knowing the story, it's about feeling the story. And I notice when I walk the whenua, there are certain parts of the kōrero that I give where the wind blows stronger. And you don't experience that unless you're on the whenua, and you will never feel that reading it in a book. You will never feel that watching it on a video. The whenua is telling the story. Tāwhiri Mātia is telling the story. As we sit here next to the ahi and I watch the flames dance around those logs, they are telling their own story.
Part of what you'll hear when you come to Ihumaatao are all the origin stories of this land, including how the ancestors of Te Waiohua travelled here from Hawaii and what life was like before Pākehā arrived. The world they describe and their pūrākau are vibrant and rich with knowledge and innovation, and especially abundance. But then...
So 1863, Governor Grey came through and issued a proclamation.
Kiane's talking about the invasion of the Waikato by colonial forces under the leadership of Governor Grey.
In a proclamation to all of our whānau in Tāmaki ki te tonga, Māngere Ihumaatao pūkaki patumahoi kirikiri takanini. Pledge your allegiance to the British Queen, or you will be ejected ejected was the kupu that was used.
We don't have time to delve deeply into the history of land confiscations in this podcast, but it's a key thread that runs through all of these episodes. It might not be entirely clear how all of this, especially historical information, relates to climate adaptation at first, but don't worry, we will get there. The point is, these actions were illegal. The war and the land confiscations were in direct violation of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which I'm sure everyone knows by now, guaranteed to hapu tino rangatiratanga, aka sovereignty over their whenua. Te Tiriti was not upheld at Ihumaatao. In fact, after tangata whenua were ejected in 1863, the land was parcelled off and given away to a handful of settlers, who then turned it into farms. When tangata whenua returned to Ihumaatao in the 1890s, they found people had moved in. You can see why the whānau prefer the word reclamation over occupation, ne. Only a tiny portion of land was ever returned, and it's there in a small village within a scarred landscape that Pania, Kiane, Stacey and their grandparents all grew up.
So my nan grew up here in Ihumaatao, and my nan had the most beautiful memories that she would constantly share with me about her pā life, her pā upbringing. My nan had a pet pig named Percy, and Percy would walk her to the bus stop, and then when she would come back from school, Percy was waiting at the bus stop for her to come back home. My great-grandfather, Papa Mac, he was a great fisherman, and so he would go out on the manukau and fish and bring home, everything for his tamariki.
In those days, the whānau lived with a constant sound of blasting from the quarries. They watched as truckloads of their precious scoria rock was taken away. Meanwhile, the estuaries were drained, and the terraced gardens that had once famously been the kaibol of Tamaki Makaurau were turned into pasture, so instead of feeding humans, that whenua fed the cows. Yet despite it all, the whānau that remained at Ihumaatao, including Kiane's grandparents, still found a way to thrive.
She shared memories of how she would get freshwater crayfish out of the awa and how they'd make their kangapiro in the awa.
Oh, yeah.
How they would get their watercress from the awa and how they'd get flounders, and she'd go floundering with her dad. Where my whare is very fertile soil, and my great-grandfather grew lots of different kinds of crops, and just as pā life should be. Every whānau grew something different, and then you'd share that amongst the whānau. And you'd, invite whānau over to, or you wouldn't even have to invite them really. They'd come and pick from your tree, and you'd go and pick from their tree. And if you had excess of whatever, you'd give it to that family, and they'd all go fishing, and they'd catch fish, and they'd smoke their fish, and they'd all give it out. That's just that abundance.
The whenua changed a lot between Kiane's nan's childhood and her own. But even then, Kiane has memories of going out fishing with her grandfather in a moana that was once abundant.
Do you want to know my fondest memory of that particular haerenga was that my grandfather, who I adored, so I was raised by my grandparents, and my grandfather was like my dad. And we went out on a king low tide out onto the manukau through 2 channels to go and find scallops. And I remember the water being really deep in the channels. It maybe wasn't that far, but as a child it was really, really far. And we went out that way, so out past the Te Tiki Pā side of the whenua. The scallops were abundant. My grandfather yet taught me how to pick up a scallop so that it wouldn't snap your fingers off. My grandmother talks about all of these beaches being white sand, white sand beaches.
When we visited Ihumaatao, there were no white sandy beaches. No scallops, no terrace gardens.
Because of all the encroachment of factories, the erosion of the whenua.
The airport, we can hear
planes, yeah. The constant development of land and quarrying comes all of that loose soil getting washed into the moana, and that when you walk down there now it's thick mud.
You have to ask, what happened here?
We were called the shit pond kids growing up.
Shit pond kids. This is Stacey again, talking about the nickname they all got growing up here in the 80s.
And everyone, when they came into the papakanga at a certain time of the day, all you could smell was just this overwhelming tiko.
Here's what happened. The Oruarangi River, where Kiane's grandmother used to gather koura, was intentionally blocked off from the moana. This was done to install sewage ponds at the mouth of the awa, on top of the fishing grounds, where the haukainga had gathered kaimoana for centuries. It'd be like someone coming along and putting a padlock on your fridge. Actually, it's worse than that.
I think about the great kai bowl that we had in the Manukau that was turned unapologetically into oxidation ponds to take on the tiko of Tāmaki Makaurau.
This is a stupid question probably, but did anybody ask you before they put the oxidation ponds out there?
No, nobody ever asked our whānau anything about anything, ever.
Ko ki ane anō tēnei.
They tell you. And they tell you in a way that says, you look at what you're doing for the greater good of Auckland. You know, our tupuna were told. And our tupuna were very peaceful people. They were ringa raupa. Well, they still are. Our whānau are manaakitanga people, you know. We're here to serve, to feed, all those things. My grandfather was a true reflection of what all of our tupuna were like. Quiet, humble, did the work, mahi a te mahi. And so when you have people who come in and speak big words and talk about laws and use kupu and whakaaro that you're not familiar with, you don't necessarily have the confidence to turn around and say, no, that's not right. You know, you might give warnings, don't dig there, there's a urupa there. But none of them ever said, you know, no, don't do that. And it's not because they didn't want to, but it's because they were the generation who lived through the oppression of colonisation in Aotearoa, you know.
What's even more insulting is that the residents of Ihumaatao weren't even connected to that wastewater system for about 20 years. Cutting the awa off from the moana to make way for oxidation ponds didn't just change the relationships between people and the places of their pepeha, it also physically changed the whole landscape.
We always correct people when they say it's a creek because it's an awa.
She's talking about the Oruarangi, which today looks quite narrow and fairly shallow in places.
When we look at the archival images and listen to the stories of our grandparents, great-grandparents, or great-grandparents, you could fit like little ships down there. So like bigger than a fishing boat that you would see now. There's a photo of a kuia standing down the end here, and there's like a ship coming to pick her up. Like a small ship, but coming to pick her up, I think. So that's how sort of wide the awa was. When that awa was closed, we weren't even born. But what I do know is behind my house was like a gully as opposed to the flat land that it is now.
I'll explain. When the river was closed off, the water began to recede and craters were left behind in the land, and these needed to be filled. What do you reckon it was filled with?
Yeah, landfill basically.
Yeah, so landfill.
Landfill. Rubbish.
Washing machines and everything, like dumping under there. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that you can see the rubbish, like it's probably deep enough down now. And it's not everywhere, there are just parcels of land that are landfill.
So the shit ponds were there for about 30 years. Then, at the end of the 90s, new technology was developed to treat sewage on land, so the oxidation ponds were removed. The Oruarangi was reopened back up to the sea, but...
When they reopened the awa, that's when there were like cars and washing machines and all those kinds of things starting to fall out of the banks.
The Oruarangi was a world away from what it had once been, and the true extent of all of those years of dumping became visible. Not only that, but further erosion means that now it's not just rubbish that's being unearthed. Here's Pania.
Some ecologists and water experts have also advised us that some of the tūpapaku will slide into the awa in just a few years' time.
Tūpapaku, the deceased. This is close to Pania's heart. Her papa is buried in the Hemitui Urupa, not far from the banks of the Oruarangi. This wāhi tapu was first established in 1918 during the Spanish influenza epidemic. It's over 100 years old.
At the time it made sense, I reckon, because there was a lot of whenua there and there was no threat of any coastal erosion.
Today, rising seas associated with climate change mean the risks are even more severe and more urgent than they might otherwise have been.
And our awa is tidal. The urupa is, during winter, constantly boggy. Yeah, and following a high tide, some of the urupa are still filled with a lot of water. And a lot of our grave diggers have observed those changes over the years as well.
Climate change is one thing. But what about the humans responsible for causing this increased vulnerability?
I have been directly involved in the governance of our marae since I was 8 years old.
Ko ki ānea nō tēnei.
And so I've been part of all of the conversations and all of the decisions and all of the everythings that have happened over that time.
Kiani remembers how proactive the whānau were, working with entities like Watercare, who manage the drinking water and wastewater services of Tāmaki Makaurau, as well as the Auckland Regional Council and the City Council, and NIWA, the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. But a lot of the advice was just to let nature take its course.
Now, our whānau as active kaitiaki were not prepared to just let that be. They wanted to support the taiao and start doing a number of initiatives that were going to support the health and well-being of the wai, of the seabed, and then of all the other areas around that wai.
And so for a decade, the hapu did just that. They worked with ecologists to reseed the mussel beds and oyster beds and replant the harakeke along the awa. They worked and worked to restore the mauri of the Ororangi with, frankly, minimal resources. They were just beginning to see results. And then
Jenner's Worldwide spilled 1,000 litres of purple dye concentrate in their factory. Jenner's, they're a freight forwarding company, and they washed that dye down their drain.
Straight into the awa.
And they didn't report it to council. They didn't report the spill at all.
It was the stuff of nightmares. The whānau woke up to tuna floating belly up, their puku completely purple.
The best thing about it was that it was purple, so you could see it. It literally turned the awa purple. The crabs took that, the mea, the powder, the concentrate, down into the sediment. And by the time Auckland councillors found out, it was too late. There was nothing they could do immediately to stop that dye from travelling and spreading.
10 years of painstaking, back-breaking mahi down the drain in a single day.
I sat in on a lot of the meetings that were happening with the engineers who they'd brought in on that, with Watercare senior staff and management, with Auckland Airport. And I remember them saying, here are all the options of the things we can do, but we should really just let nature take its course. And again, it was just that cop-out of, we're not really going to do anything about it.
The whānau pushed for more to be done, and a few options were floated, including closing the awa all over again and dredging it.
And actually, it was something that we were seriously considering as a whānau. Because of all of the land dumping that had happened and knowing that there were other things in that awa, we were like, well, if there's an opportunity to actually dredge the awa and get rid of some of the mud and get rid of some of the other para that's in there, maybe it's a sacrifice that we need to make. And it's hard to make those decisions. It's really hard because you always want what's best for the taiao. And at the same time, sometimes what's best for the taiao means disrupting the taiao for a little bit. And so we had come to the conclusion that that was going to be a good option.
The whānau started talking through the logistics of the plan, like how to float a digger up the awa. But then all of a sudden,
the meetings just stopped. And there was no further discussion to be had.
When people talk about colonisation, they're often referring to activities that happened in the past, historically. But this is a classic example of ongoing and very present colonisation.
There's a point where we as a whānau go, well, how much effort do we put in to try and reduce and minimise the effects that all of these factories and all of this development is having on our awa? How much effort do we put into that when these guys are not slowing down? No. They're only intensifying.
Well, you can't keep up. Surely.
We can't.
No.
And so it's like you can't even fix this and try and make it better when you've got 3 new factories in the next, 3 months popping up. and the ongoing and additional pollution that's coming with that.
Jennas Worldwide were eventually fined around $100,000. Small change for a big company, but what a difference it could have made to Te Taiao. Only that money was never put towards repairing the harm.
No one's ever seen that money.
The ship ponds have been gone for nearly 40 years, but the moana is still a long way from the kai bowl it used to be.
You know, people just wash crap down their drains, don't even think where it goes. It's polluted our moana, and so you just can't eat kai moana. And if you think about the mussels and the oysters, you know, they are the cleaners of our wai, and so you definitely wouldn't eat those because you are eating all the para that they're trying to clean out of there.
Hey, te tuine. Nadine, I have to let you know, just listening, my horns are starting to come up and my fangs are starting to poke out and I'm going, started to do my kamate. Yeah, I was feeling very uncomfortable. That's actually quite painful to listen to, you know. So I'm just sitting here feeling that and just wondering, wow, what do we do next?
It's so painful, and it reminds me of something you said in the first season, Roya, about robbing life for life, but in this case, it's actually robbing life for teko.
For me, it's kind of like, we're wanting you to put your hand down the toilet and pull out a kumara, and then put your plate of kai on top of the toilet and invite everybody to come and have a kai. You know, karo hoki e te tuine. I don't know whether to be sad or angry right now.
I know, and for people who take so much pride and have a whole tribal legacy of being able to provide and sustain thousands of people, it's just so demoralising. You know, and I wish I could say this is just an isolated case, but these stories, I know, are echoed all over the country, and that is the starting point for so many climate adaptation research projects for Māori. It's this position of deficit and degradation caused directly by colonisation.
Yeah, and most often those of us who are forced to live in the symptom were often blamed for it.
Yeah, it's like this poverty or poor health is our fault, you know?
What? Hey, if we have a look at the bigger picture, legislation, you know, and the impact of legislation and that guy, what's his name, Gray, and all those colonial powers over the years, you know, but the thing is, it's still happening today. My God, I'm in the Māori Land Court right now today and it's still happening.
Yeah, exactly. And Kiani mentioned that when she said that these guys aren't slowing down, and in some cases it's actually speeding up.
Listening to this and I'm feeling it, and my feelings are, you know, sad. I'm sad and angry. But what I understand today through my experience is that it's human and it's natural to feel sad and feel it, and angry and feel it. But for me, it's not healthy to go to the extremes of falling into morbid reflection, self-pity and victimhood. But you see, that's not what we're about to hear, actually. Hey, quite totally the opposite.
That's so true. I could feel the frustration and anger at Ihumaatao, of course. And there was also deep grief, you know, just coming to terms with the extent of the pain and the loss of land and the loss of connections that people have endured. But what really shines through the most is their determination and their resistance.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the word passive resistance, and humility could be misconstrued or misunderstood. For some people, it might mean being a doormat. War was certainly not a doormat, I must say that. But, you know, I think the passive resistance and the humility we're talking about is about standing our space, standing our authenticity, standing in our truth, and not having to justify all the time, but just be.
Tautoko. And actually, that's a great place to head back to Ihumaatao to hear what standing in that authenticity and mana motuhake looks like with our climate change, climate adaptation lens on.
The supporters have arrived from across the country to be at Ihumaatao. There are now more than 200 people on the site with no signs of the occupation letting up.
Like Parihaka and Owairaka and Pākai Tore, the campaign to protect Ihumaatao forms part of a long whakapapa of peaceful resistance. And at the heart of it, literally, burning home fires.
It was cold.
It was about pushing the line back and pushing the police back.
Stacey's telling me how the fires at Ihumaatao were first lit, and it's pretty crack up.
There was some rangatahi out in the field out there. They had this half of a drum. They put some wood in it and they set it on fire. The police came along with their, what are those powder things, fire extinguishers, and put it out, and then they just went somewhere else and lit another fire. The police went over and put it out and they said, no more fires.
I wonder how that went down.
By the end of that day, I think we had as many fires as there are volcanic cones in Tāmaki Makaurau. We stood up on the maunga and you could just see all of the different fires that had been lit, all of the different people who were around them. You had a Muslim community, you had the LGBT community, you had a community of Pākehā, you had the university kids who were metro kids, and by the time they left they were radicals and completely different people, and they would just have all this different motivation for being there, and so that fire was what held them all together.
You can understand why the promise of a new housing development to serve the greater good of Auckland on stolen land felt more than just a little insulting. After the eviction, the quarrying, the destruction of gardens to make way for farms, the draining of awa to install shit ponds on top of mahinga kai, white sandy beaches turned to sludge, and purple tuna floating belly up. This was a matter of environmental and social justice.
And this is what the ahi whita reminds us of, is the fire that we have in our bellies to pursue justice for our whenua and our whānau, but also the fire in our hearts to drive our passion and commitment towards those kaupapa that we are involved in. Because I can see the ahis and the smoke from the whare that I'm staying in at the moment, and it warms me when I see that, because I know that it's whānau who are up there lighting the fire, and that they are still here and still committed to our kaupapa.
Yeah, so it had the effect too of bringing people back home, did it? And like sort of galvanising around
I think
these
it made our
focus.
whānau more proud of Ihumaatao and where they come from, and inspired them and gave them the confidence to exercise mana motuhake and rangatiratanga for our whenua.
The reclamation was successful in stopping the development. And there's a lot more to this story, but we don't have time to tell it here. If you want to learn more, the whānau produced a doco called Ake, 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 and you should really go and watch it. But what happens from here is still the subject of negotiation. Not that that's slowing the whānau down.
The whenua is still unresolved, but we don't care what the government are doing. We're just doing the mahi and working towards achieving the aspirations that our whānau have for this whenua. And their aspirations is to reclaim the ngahere and our marakai. And if we are in our true mana motuhake and our rangatiratanga, then we'll do that. Ka koke atonu ngā mahi, ka mahi atonu ngā mahi mo ake, ake, ake.
So what does climate action look like through a mana motuhake lens? For the Te Ahi Waru research team, one of the first things to get right was the language.
Centering the conversation around climate change was a challenge for us.
Of course, whānau know what climate change is. They're living it. But as a concept, the term tends to conveniently obscure the role of colonisation and often becomes abstract and external, a political debate about costs and trade-offs.
We had to change the narrative very early on and refocus it on things that mattered most to our whānau and language that they could relate to as well. And talking about the realities at the urupā and focusing on the houses that are within the flood zones was much more relatable to our whānau. Yeah, so that made it easier to have the conversations around what could be included in our climate resilience plan.
Developing a climate resilience plan for Ihumaatao sits at the core of Te Ahi Waru's research, and within it lies the dream to restore the kaibole of Tāmaki Makaurau to Ihumaatao.
The vision for this whenua in particular was to reclaim it for what it was once used for. And so that is to grow kai again and to reclaim the native rako on our whenua that was lost. through urbanisation and colonisation. And I think about the ngahere that we are working towards. And, I'm looking at the tikauka that was planted there during the whenua escalation back in 2019. And that was the year that our whānau came up with that ngahere whakaora plan.
The ngahere whakaora plan is a 200-year vision for this whenua. But even in 5 years, you can see the results.
And I look at that harakeke and I think, look at what we've been able to achieve in the last 3 years alone.
That'd be taller than us right
now.
It's huge.
And that makes me hopeful for my tamariki and my mokopuna as well. We've established a kai nursery here, and at its peak we were growing something like 1,600 seedlings. And those seedlings were offered to our whānau, and still are today, for free to help support them with their kai sovereignty projects. Earlier this year we harvested kumara for the third time in 156 years. So that was really exciting, and that's a 3-year project that we've been working on.
This is huge, not just practically. Harvesting kumara here at Ihumaatao is deeply symbolic as a tohu of mana motuhake and revival and regeneration. That sweet little potato raised in the scoria rock of ancestors once more. As well as that, the whānau have planted a rongoā garden, a kai nursery and a food forest, and they're replanting the repo, the wetlands that were once drained. So far, the whānau have planted over 16,000 native rako. And if you come on this hikoi, you can plant one too.
One of the highlights for me through that project is that earlier this year, the water level at the puna and the repo were the highest recorded in the oral histories of our whānau over the last 150 years.
In this case, higher water levels is a good thing.
That's happening because the whenua is regenerating itself, the puna regenerating itself, but also because we've put an end to the farming that has happened on this whenua for the past 156 years since the whenua was confiscated from our whānau.
One of the things that I've personally been monitoring are the manu.
Here's Kiani again.
And just paying attention to what manu have come back in the last 10 years. And so I've noticed that our kōtare population has significantly increased. And I actually noticed it a couple of weeks ago because they were all fighting in the air. And I'm like, because they're such noisy birds too. And our kōtuku population, we've got grey herons that roost in the trees just opposite the papakainga on the other side of the awa. And that's beautiful, and those observations have really had an impact on how our whānau and our house decide to maintain our māra. And so we, first and foremost, we planted natives in the hopes that those natives that we planted would attract more manus. So then we planted kai, and then we fed ourselves.
There's some awesome projects that our rangatahi of our marae are leading, like Para Patrol. They report illegal dumpings that are happening around our papakainga.
Para Patrol have a whole raft of kaupapa around supporting rangatahi to take action and exercise kaitiakitanga, including learning the ropes to lead the guided hikoi so that whakiane can take a rest. But there's heaps to do, and everything is urgent, especially the future of the urupā.
There have always been ongoing conversations around how to protect the bank where the urupā is. Everybody sort of pays lip service to the we want to help you, but essentially it's we want to help you so you'll shut up, not we want to help you because we believe that it should be done and it was our responsibility to do it. There's never been a true commitment from those who legally, from a Pākehā worldview, own that awa to do anything about anything in that awa. It's always been our whānau of Ihumaatao, our hapu, our marae, and it's really only been until now that we have the capacity through the research mahi that we've been doing to look at okay, what are we going to do about the urupa and what can be done and what are all the options and what's the long-term option? Stacey's doing an incredible job working with whānau to say, what is it that we want and what can we do and what might that cost?
And it's not just practical questions like how or when to adapt, but how can the whānau respond to the multiple crises they face in a way that centres and explicitly values the cultural knowledge and wisdom and practices that they hold. For example,
what purpose do urupa have in our lives today and what purpose do they serve for our future? Yes, there is the immediate need at the urupa, knowing that we live next to an awa, that there's going to be higher tides in future, knowing all of these things and what's to come. We're now having conversations about what does that actually mean in practice for us as Māori? And what does it mean when we are facing floods and storms and all of these other things, separate to the fact that how we got here in the first place was again a result of colonisation.
That's why our rangahau or our research project is so important, so that we are able to understand what those threats are and how we as a hapu and whānau can respond to those, and then decide how we will prioritise them.
In the first season of Ko Papakorangi, there were lots of discussions from a theoretical and structural perspective about the costs and benefits of climate change adaptation. But Ihumaatao paints a picture of how it all plays out on the ground for a hika, and crucially, why we can't separate climate change from colonisation.
The fact that the Crown continues to degrade our whenua means that climate change is impacting us much more than it would have had we had retained our kaitiakitanga over the whenua through the generations and not have had to suffer through the consequences of other people's decision making that has then gone on to degrade, devastate, pollute our waterways, our land, our air, which only then increases our susceptibility to all of the other issues that come with climate change.
It also shows us really clearly why the spiritual and mental well-being of the people is directly tied to the health of Papatuanuku. Ko au te whenua, ko te whenua, ko au.
Using Ihumaatao as an example, if parts of my body were broken off, cut off, scratched off, chewed off, whether that be physically someone beating me and bruising me on my tinana, or whether that be kupu going into my head constantly telling me that I'm not enough and taking away parts of myself. That is the same as quarrying this maunga, right? And you look at the maunga and the maunga's not there anymore. And I don't know that enough of us really stop to think about the whenua as a living being. And it's not because we don't believe it is. We believe it is. We talk about Papatuanuku all the time. But does that whenua feel that pain? Does that maunga feel itself being cut at and dispersed across the tāmaki to have cars driving over it every day? Do we know what that feels like? It's so easy to forget because we do. We live in a world where we have to pay bills. And so when you're just so busy trying to figure out how to feed your whānau, you don't have time to sit down and go, oh, let me just have a little wānanga with myself about my kariaroto. People who think about capitalism and money and taxes don't realise that none of that shit is going to help their tamariki or their mokopuna to survive when Papatuanuku decides that she's going to take over. Because taxes aren't going to do anything when they can't eat, because she refuses to give them kai.
This is quite a different perspective to the idea that it's people that need to heal Papatuanuku.
He whakatauki. Whatungarongaro te tangata toitu te whenua. The reality is, the whenua doesn't need us. We need the whenua. The moana, the awa, doesn't need us. We need it. And we will all drop dead tomorrow, and these things will thrive They will thrive without us. We are the pōtiki of the taiao. The atua gave of themselves to create us. It's a bit egotistical to say, we're going to go and help them. Because actually, it's us that needs the awhi. It's us that needs the healing from them. Because everything is connected. Every thread of our being is connected.
Well, that's nearly it for this episode. But first, e Ruia, how are you feeling after this story? Or he aha o whakaaro?
You know, when we sit around the fire, there's something powerful about a fire. And it can be destructive, or it can warm people and keep people and hold people. Man, that's exciting. And, you know, as I was just feeling my way through that painful experience, I can see the embers. That's hope. Yeah, and, you know, what I also am grateful for and excited about is that these people, these whānau who descend from hape, who descend from the tainui waka, who descend from te Waiohua, and who descend from te Ahiwaru, are descendants of great navigators who crossed that big, vast, wide ocean of the Pacific. And from our original places coming here, we survived. We have survived. We are alive. And it ain't finished yet.
It ain't finished yet, that is for sure. And you know, in every place I went to for this podcast, I asked people about what's keeping them going, you know, and I asked them about that notion of hope that we often talk about. And I got some really insightful answers. So that's how we're going to close out this episode.
Hope for me is what I'm surviving on. I'm surviving on pure hope and the vision of our krani ma, our krani pa, even though I'm nowhere near being a grandmother, is for my mokopuna. And the hope that one day they will be so grounded in their identity, who they are, where they come from, that they will be able to influence the shit that goes on at a governance level, at council levels, and they will be able to stand their ground to, you know, be good kaitiaki for the whenua so that we don't get covered in concrete like the rest of Tāmaki Makaurau.
Our stories are stories about a resilient people and a resilient landscape that have endured all these injustices and are still here and are working towards being a thriving papakainga. And yeah, we are still here. We are hopeful and we are excited about what the future has to hold for us. And this phase in particular, because I feel like right now our whānau are in the stage of manamotu hake.
I think hope's a pretty fluffy word. Determination is the word that I use. Disruption is a word that I use. I have no choice. I was born into this world of wahine Māori. I have no choice. I have the responsibility of those who have gone before me to uphold the mātauranga that they had. And I have a responsibility to my child to disrupt this world to ensure that she has a world that she can stomp into, because she won't be walking into it. She'll be stomping into it.
In the next episode of Ko Papa Ko Rangi Ahi Ka, we're heading to Tairāwhiti.
I have never seen the beach so ugly.
I don't know how they planted those slopes to begin with. It's just like vertical.
Man has to change its practices to heal papatuanuku and tangaro.
The future that we're heading into is going to force us to be more collaborative and more community-minded.
I've tried living away from the coast, but my roots call me back. Mm-hmm. It's my home, and I ain't leaving.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can write a review on Apple Podcasts or tēnā kōrerohia ki tō hoa. Tell a mate, spread the word. Mai kore ake koutou e pūpuri ana ki ngā ahika. Arā, Ko te ahiwaru, te weutai rāwhiti, te morehu whenua, Ngāti toa rangatira, waihoki Ngāti huri. This podcast series was made by the Vision Mātauranga team at Te Komata o Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge. And don't forget to check out the first series. You can find the links in the show notes. Ahi Ka was written by me, Nadine Hura, with immense support from the wider team and co-hosted by our po tikanga, Ruia Apirahama. Huge thanks to Naomi Simmons, Tyro Bigby, Kate Turner, and the whole DSC crew, led by Phil Wiles and Kāhui Chair Sandy Morrison. Our producers and editors were Kirsten Johnston and Melody Thomas from Popsock Media. Music was by Ruia Apirahama and Ma, and additional music was licensed under Creative Commons from Blue Dot Sessions. Phil Brownlee was our audio mix engineer, extra script advice from Adam Dudding. Many thanks to the Spin-Off for hosting us. And thanks to the RNZ and Manawahine Loading Docks team for the news footage.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.